My parents said, "You're just getting in our way. Disappear and don't come back." Without money, without a chance. 15 years later. I bought their house at auction. I stood at the threshold, my hand resting on the worn brass handle. The house loomed in front of me, a shadow of my past. The door was the same one I had slammed shut behind me 15 years ago, though now it was mine. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges carrying the weight of memories I hadn't asked for. My eyes scanned the hallway, the narrow space that had once been a battlefield for my dignity. The walls were chipped, the floors stained with years of wear. But beneath it all, I could still see the faint traces of what it used to be. It was here that they had told me I was a burden. It was here that they'd kicked me out, leaving me standing on the doorstep with nothing but my pride and the promise of a future I hadn't yet built. I could still hear their voices in the back of my mind, as if they were just around the corner, waiting for me to disappear again. "You're only getting in our way. It would be better if you weren't here." The words had burned into my soul. I hadn't heard them since that day, but they were as fresh as if they'd been spoken yesterday. They had chased me for years, haunting me in the dark of night, reminding me of the rejection, the pain, the sense of being unwanted. And now, here I was, back. Not as the boy who was tossed out like trash, but as the man who had come to take control. I stepped inside, my shoes clicking on the wooden floors, each echo sounding louder than the last. The familiar scent of old furniture and dust filled the air, and it almost made me want to gag. But I held my ground. I didn't flinch. I was here for a reason. The living room was the same. The couch they had bought when I was a child. The TV that had broken countless times and never seemed worth replacing. The coffee table where I'd sat with them, pretending everything was fine. It was all still here, but it felt different now. The place that had once been my prison was now mine to claim. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood in. The screams, the shouting, the tears. It was all here in every corner, in every inch of this house. But the one thing that had always stuck with me, that had gnawed at my insides, was their cruelty, their cold dismissal. It wasn't just the act of kicking me out. It was the way they said it, the way they made me feel like I wasn't even human. I had tried so hard to make them proud. I had worked tirelessly, striving to be the son they could be proud of. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. "You're a burden. You're in the way." They made me feel like an inconvenience, a mistake, someone who had overstayed their welcome. And when they finally decided they couldn't put up with me any longer, they threw me out like a stray dog. My father's eyes were cold, and my mother, usually the soft one, had just stood there silent. Neither of them cared that I was a child, lost and confused. I was nothing to them, but now as I walked through these very rooms, the power shifted. I had the upper hand. I wasn't the boy they discarded. I was the man who had built something from nothing, and this house, this symbol of rejection, was now mine. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. There was no time for sentimentality, no time for anger or tears. I had a goal in mind, and I couldn't let myself be swayed by the past. I walked deeper into the house, the room seeming smaller now, more suffocating. The kitchen came into view, the place where they had always gathered for dinner, the place where I had stood countless times begging for scraps of love, only to be met with cold glares and harsh words. It was here that they had made me feel invisible, like I was nothing more than an inconvenience. And then there was the staircase, the one that led up to the bedrooms. My bedroom. The room that had once been my sanctuary, my refuge, had turned into a prison. I could still hear my footsteps echoing in my mind as I made my way upstairs for the last time, packing a bag with whatever I could carry. I could almost feel the heat of their glares on my back as I left, but none of that mattered anymore. I walked to the center of the living room and paused. The place that had been the scene of my most painful memories now felt empty, hollow. I could almost hear the laughter, the arguments, the moments of fleeting happiness. But it was all gone now. The family I had once known no longer existed. I was no longer their burden. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the house documents, my proof. It was funny how something as simple as a piece of paper could hold so much weight. This piece of paper meant I had taken control. I had taken back what they had stolen from me. I wasn't the boy they tossed out anymore. I was the man who had come back to take what was rightfully mine. I turned and looked at the door behind me, the door that had once been my way out, my only escape. This time, though, it wasn't an exit. It was just another part of the house that I own now, and I didn't need to look back. There was nothing left for me here but the final, cold acknowledgement that I had put the past to rest. With the documents in my hand, I walked out of the house, closing the door behind me with a soft click. It was over. 15 years. That's how long it's been. A lifetime, really. But it feels like the world I left behind is still stuck in the same place, trapped in that moment of rejection, that moment when I was told I was nothing. Back then, I could never have imagined standing here, outside that same house, with nothing but time between me and that boy who had walked away. Back then, I had no plan, no idea of where I was going or what would happen next. The only thing that burned in my mind was the need to escape, to disappear before they could destroy what little dignity I had left. But what I didn't know was that leaving would be the beginning of a journey, one that would take me to places I never thought possible. I still remember that day as if it happened yesterday. The coldness in my father's voice, the sharpness in my mother's silence. They had made up their minds and no amount of pleading would change it. "You're just in the way. You're a burden. You should leave." Their words cut deep, but it wasn't just the words. It was the finality. The way they spoke as if I wasn't a person anymore, as if I wasn't even worth the effort of keeping around. The house had always been their sanctuary, their pride, and I was just an obstacle in their perfect little world. It didn't matter that I was still their child, that I was still trying to understand who I was, what I wanted from life. To them, I was nothing more than a nuisance. And when I could no longer be ignored, they'd chosen the simplest solution: get rid of me. I remember the night before they kicked me out. It had been an ordinary evening at the dinner table, distant but typical. I sat there, the silence wrapping around us like a thick fog. They were too absorbed in their own conversation to notice I was there, and the few words I managed to speak went unanswered. I had gotten used to it by then. That night my mind had wandered to the idea of leaving. It was an impulse at first, a fleeting thought, but it became more and more real as I sat there. I thought, what if I just disappeared? What if I never came back? But I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't prepared for them to actually make me leave. Yet the next morning it happened. I woke up to my father standing over me, his expression stone cold. "Get up," he'd said, his voice low. "We need to talk." I didn't even need to hear the rest of it. The tone in his voice was enough to tell me everything. The conversation was brief. There were no apologies, no explanations. It was just a simple, cold command. "Pack your things and go." My mother didn't say anything. She just stood there, her eyes not meeting mine. She had nothing to offer, no love, no sympathy, just silence. I remember my hands shaking as I packed the few belongings I could find. The clothes, a few books, the essentials, nothing more. I couldn't bring myself to look at them, but I could feel their eyes on me, weighing me down with their disdain. My father's voice cracked through the air again. "This is for the best." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. What good would it do? I had learned long ago that my pleas meant nothing, so I left. The door slammed behind me and I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. This was it. This was the end of everything I thought I knew about family. I had no place to go, no idea of what came next, but I didn't need to know. In that moment, I felt something new, a cold, deep relief. I wasn't trapped anymore. I wandered the streets for weeks, sleeping in alleyways and shelters. I had no idea how to survive, no money, no job. But I knew one thing. I was done being their burden. No matter how long it took, I would never be that person again. I learned quickly. The world outside that house was harsh, unforgiving. I didn't trust anyone. Not the people who passed me by on the streets, not the few who offered a hand. I kept my distance, kept my head down. Survival wasn't about making friends. It was about making it through each day. I found odd jobs at first, the kind that barely paid enough to keep me fed. working in warehouses, washing dishes, anything that would give me some kind of paycheck. It wasn't much, but it was enough to survive. But survival wasn't enough for me. I had tasted the bitterness of being discarded, of being nothing more than a nuisance, and that taste stayed with me, driving me to do more, to be more. I couldn't allow myself to be weak again. I couldn't let myself fall into the same hole they had left me in. So I made a vow. I would build myself up. I would show them that I was worthy, not of their love, but of my own respect. I would never again let anyone make me feel like I was a burden. I worked tirelessly every hour I could. I studied, I learned, I adapted. Every moment was a step forward, and slowly, painfully, I began to climb. I saved, I invested. I watched as opportunities came and went. But I wasn't looking for handouts. I was looking for ways to earn what I deserved. Every decision I made had one purpose: to ensure I would never have to go back to that life. Years passed. I became more than just a survivor. I became someone people noticed, someone people respected. And with each success, I moved closer to the life I had always dreamed of. A life where I wasn't anyone's burden. A life where I held the power, not the people who had cast me aside. And all the while, I kept an eye on the house that had never been a home to me. It stayed in the back of my mind, a reminder of everything I'd lost and everything I intended to take back. When the auction came up, I knew it was fate. The opportunity to own it, to take back what they had taken from me, was too perfect. And so I did. Now here I was, standing on the threshold. The house was mine, and I had only one thing left to do: put an end to the past. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the faint sound reverberating in the silence of the house. I paused for a moment, standing just inside, letting the stillness wash over me. The scent of dust, old wood, and stale memories filled the air. The walls, once so familiar, seemed smaller now. The room stretched out before me, every corner holding a piece of my past, pieces that had been shattered, ignored, and left to decay. I took a slow step forward, the floorboards groaning under my weight. My gaze drifted across the room. There, just to the left of the door, was the worn couch where I used to sit, trying to avoid the tension that always hung in the air. The old coffee table, scratched and stained from years of use. The kitchen tucked just beyond the living room, where my mother once made meals she barely tasted. Too busy to notice the hollow faces around the table. I didn't need to go further. I knew this house, every inch of it. I took another step, and then another. My eyes scanned the walls, tracing the spots where family pictures had once been hung, where memories had been created. There were no pictures now, no signs of life or warmth, just the emptiness that had been there long before I left, long before the last words were spoken. The memories came rushing back, uninvited, relentless. The fight that had been the final blow. I was 16. My father had been sitting at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, his face etched with that same constant frown. My mother had been standing by the counter, not looking at me, but instead focusing on the sink. It was as if I didn't exist unless they needed something from me. "You're getting in our way," my father had said, his voice sharp, as always. I had been standing by the door wanting nothing more than to leave, to escape. I had tried to keep my distance, but they had cornered me. My mother's silence was the worst part. She never spoke unless she had to, and when she did, it was as though her words were just noise in the background. "It would be better if you weren't here." Her words had struck me harder than anything my father could say. I had felt it then, the finality, the rejection. I had been so small, so helpless in that moment, but I had also known, deep down, that I would never let anyone treat me like that again. "Go," my father had told me. "You don't belong here." That was it. That was all. No explanation, no remorse, just cold indifference. I had packed my things that night as quickly as I could, as though every second I spent in that house was another second they could take from me. I had left without a word, without a tear. And now, standing in the very place where they had discarded me, I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't anger or sadness, not the way I had imagined it would be. No, it was control. Control over my emotions. Control over the past. I had already moved on years ago, but this was closure. I walked through the house, each room a silent witness to my years of suffering. The living room, the kitchen, the hallway, nothing had changed. It was as though the years hadn't touched it, but they had touched me. I wasn't the same person who had walked out that door all those years ago. I wasn't the scared, angry child who thought the world had ended that day. I had rebuilt myself from the ground up, piece by piece. The man I was now was not the boy they had tossed aside. I had strength, purpose, and more importantly, I had control. The house, now mine, was the symbol of that control. There was no rush, no need to make a scene. I wasn't interested in that. My revenge wasn't about tearing this house down. It wasn't about shouting or screaming. No, my revenge was quiet, calculated. It was about showing them that I had won, that I had taken what was mine. The next step was easy. I pulled out the documents from my bag, the auction papers, the deed. I could almost hear the echoes of my father's voice in my head, the same one that had dismissed me, told me I would never amount to anything. "You're a burden," he'd said. Well, it was time for him to see who the real burden was. It wasn't me. I walked over to the table, spreading the papers out in front of me. The deed to the house was in my hands. My hands, not theirs. This place, once a prison, was now mine to control. I felt the weight of the papers in my palm, the reality of it all settling in. I wasn't here to make them feel anything. They didn't deserve that. I wasn't here to kick them while they were down. I was here to draw a line in the sand, to remind myself, and anyone who would listen, that I had fought for everything I had, and this house was the final piece of the puzzle. I took one last look around the room, letting it all sink in. The house was empty, and so was I. Empty of bitterness, empty of resentment. I didn't need that. I needed nothing more than this. The past was over, and now I was the one in control. As I sat in the silence of the house, the weight of the moment pressing down on me, my mind drifted back. It was almost automatic, familiar, like slipping into a memory so old it felt as if it had been lived by someone else. But it hadn't been. It was me. And the journey from that point, 15 years ago, to where I sat now, holding the deed to this house, was the story I had to tell. I wasn't always the man I was today. There had been a time when I was weak. That night when they kicked me out of the house, I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going or how I was going to survive. I was just a boy with a bruised heart, a boy left out on the cold streets without a place to go. I remember the night air, cold and biting. The streets stretched out before me like an endless expanse of uncertainty. I could feel the sting in my chest, the sting of being unwanted, of being discarded. I remember walking aimlessly, barely aware of where I was going. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a blur. I ended up at a shelter that night, the kind that takes in anyone who needs help. There, for the first time, I realized how little I had, how little anyone cared about me. The beds were thin, the blankets even thinner. I shared space with strangers, none of whom would ever remember me. But I also knew one thing. I couldn't let myself be swallowed up by the emptiness that had swallowed so many others. I couldn't let their apathy become mine. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had no family to rely on, no friends who cared. All I had was my will to survive. I started doing whatever I could to make money, doing odd jobs here and there, anything to keep myself from falling deeper into the pit of despair. I worked long hours, sometimes in places that smelled like oil and rust, sometimes in places where the air was thick with sweat and frustration. It didn't matter. I wasn't there for the comfort, I was there for the change. I vowed then that I would never go back to that life. Never again would I let anyone, least of all my family, see me as a burden. I promised myself that I would climb, no matter how long it took, no matter how many times I fell. I wasn't going to be a victim of my circumstances. I would change those circumstances. And I did. Slowly at first. I learned to be resourceful, learned how to make connections in the world I had never been a part of. Every time I felt myself slipping back into the darkness, I fought harder. I found stability in the most unexpected places, sometimes in the people I met, sometimes in the work I took on. But most of all, I found it in myself. It wasn't easy, it wasn't quick, but with every step I moved further away from the boy who had been kicked out of his own home, from the boy who had thought he was nothing. And with every small victory, I could feel the past slipping further into the distance. I began to build a life for myself, piece by piece, until one day I realized I had everything I needed to make sure this house would never belong to them again. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, but it wasn't enough. No, that wasn't enough. I could have gone on and lived a normal life, away from the people who had abandoned me. I could have built something for myself and left it at that. But I had sworn to myself that I wouldn't just rise above them. I would rise above everything they had tried to teach me, that I was worthless, that I was a burden. I would show them that I was capable of so much more than they ever thought. That was why, when I saw the house come up for auction, I knew what I had to do. It wasn't about money or the house itself. It was about control. It was about taking something that had once been theirs and making it mine. The house had been their symbol of success, the thing they could hang over me as a reminder of my place. But now it was mine. And with it, I would rewrite the story of my life, on my terms. I thought back to the day I left, the day they tossed me out like I was nothing. That night, as I walked away from everything I had ever known, I had no idea where I was going. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to be that boy anymore. I wasn't going to let them define me. And here I was, 15 years later, the one who held the keys to the house, not them. I was the one in control. I took a deep breath and looked at the papers again. This wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. This was the final step in my journey. This was the end of the story that had been written for me by people who never cared. Now I was the one writing it, and I wasn't finished yet. It was time to take the next step. The house was eerily quiet now, its silence almost suffocating. The grand staircase that once led to my childhood bedroom now felt cold, uninviting. I stood in the foyer, my fingers grazing the edges of the wooden railings, and the memories flooded back. Every inch of this house was a reminder of what they had made me feel. It was strange, how the years could change everything. The house seemed smaller now, as if it had shrunk to fit the memory of what it used to be. I remember the first time I had walked up those stairs, the sound of my feet echoing through the hallway, full of hope and joy. That was before the cruelty, before the words that seared themselves into my soul. "You're only getting in our way." The words stung even now. They were said without hesitation, without remorse. My mother standing in the kitchen doorway, her eyes cold and unmoving. My father, who had barely looked up from his paper. My brother, who had stood behind them, silent but complicit. "It would be better if you weren't here." The words had hung in the air like a thick, poisonous fog. They had pierced me in a way I never expected. The rejection, the dismissal, the finality of it all. They didn't want me. I wasn't a part of their world. They had made it clear in no uncertain terms. I was nothing to them. But what they didn't know was that they had just set something in motion. I had spent years hating them for what they did, for what they said, for the way they made me feel like I was less than human. But as time passed, that hate slowly twisted itself into something else, something far colder. It became resolve, a quiet, burning determination to show them that I wasn't broken, that I wasn't the person they thought I was. The first few years after I left were difficult. I lived in places that weren't even worth remembering. I did whatever I had to do to survive, and I made sure I never asked for help from anyone. I had learned that the world didn't care, and if the world didn't care, I was going to make it care. I started from nothing, worked my way up from scratch. I remember those first few nights lying awake in a small, cramped room, wondering what I was doing, wondering if I had made the right decision by leaving, wondering if I had just walked away from everything that might have made my life easier. But every time those thoughts crept in, I silenced them, because I had made a promise to myself. I promised myself that I would never go back to being the boy who had been thrown out. I would never be the boy who had let his family's words define him. Instead, I would build a new life, one that was mine, and mine alone. I would prove to them, to everyone, that I could rise from the ashes of their rejection and become something they would never see coming. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their validation. I needed nothing from them except the cold, hard truth that they were wrong about me. That was all the fuel I needed to keep going. Years went by, and I kept my head down, kept working, kept building. Slowly, surely, I started to make something of myself. I didn't tell anyone about my past, about the family that had abandoned me. I didn't need anyone's pity. I didn't need anyone to know my story. But deep down, I knew. I knew exactly what I was doing. Every step forward was one step closer to this moment. The moment I would take this house. The moment I would stand in front of them, not as the broken boy they had tossed aside, but as the man who had built something out of nothing. And now here I was, in the very house that had once been a symbol of their power, their control, the house that had been their fortress, their sanctuary. Now it was just a structure, a place, a thing that I owned. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps soft on the hardwood floors, the weight of the moment sinking in. I could almost hear the echoes of their voices, my father's dismissive grumble, my mother's sharp tongue. I could hear the way they had shut me out, over and over, until I had no choice but to leave. But now I was the one in control. I walked into the kitchen, the place where everything had begun. I could see her there, standing by the counter, her arms crossed as she looked at me with disdain. I could hear her voice, too, as she had scolded me for being too much trouble, too much of a burden. And then I saw it, the table, the one where we had all gathered for family meals, the table that had once seemed so full, so complete. Now it felt empty, like a shell of what it had been, just like the family that had once occupied it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the table. I thought about all the things I had endured, all the hurt, all the anger. I thought about the years I had spent trying to prove something to people who would never care. But now, standing in this house, holding the deed in my hands, I realized something. I didn't need to prove anything to them. This house wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about closure. I walked over to the table and placed the documents in front of me, the papers that signified the end of the story they had tried to write for me, the story where I was the burden, the story where I was the failure. It was over. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to make a scene. This quiet, calm moment was the victory. It was the end. And it was enough. With the documents in hand, I turned, walked out of the room, and headed for the front door. I didn't look back. And as the door closed behind me, I knew, without a doubt, that I had finally put the past to rest. This house, this life, was mine now. The story had been rewritten.